Well, hello there and welcome to this week's edition of African Perspective. I am Tshepiso Makwetla. This week we focus on Africa's goal of halving its conflicts by next year. Is Vision 2020 really realistic? African Union leaders gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia for the 32nd ordinary session recently to grapple with this and other issues. So the AU has put a target of 2020 for silencing the guns on the continent. The pockets of conflict in Africa lead to its people, refugees and also internally displaced people. The question many are asking, is this target achievable? The African Development Bank says Africa has the highest number of fragile states globally, affecting about 200 million people. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa says leaders on the continent are committed to ending wars on the continent.
The AU has decided that it wants to stop wars. It wants to silence the guns by 2020. And that is in a short space of time. At the same time, measures are being taken by regional bodies to address the various conflicts that are taking place. For instance, in South Sudan, IGAD has taken steps to seek to bring about peace in South Sudan. An agreement has now been reached, and those who have been at loggerheads with each other are all going to go back and form a government, a transitional government. And that, in our view, is important because in the end it is going to make sure that there is peace in that country and a number of other countries as well. Regional bodies are taking charge of the peace formation movement and making sure that we ensure that there is peace. So the continent and its leaders is not sitting back and doing nothing. It is continuously engaged in peace efforts.
Former South African President Thabo Mbeki, who also attended as part of former heads of state, says it's imperative that countries such as Sudan and South Sudan are at peace.
The government of Sudan, which had been negotiating a cessation of hostilities agreement with its SPLM North, has then taken a unilateral decision to declare a permanent ceasefire. It is unilateral. The government of Sudan says, for us, no more war. So they declare a permanent ceasefire, not a temporary one. So for instance, that's a statement from Khartoum that as government, we are no longer in my violent conflict with anybody in the country, including the SPLM North. So we haven't engaged the SPLM North about that to see what their own response is to that permanent, because all of them had been proclaiming temporary ceasefires. But the government has now made it permanent.
So the Democratic Republic of Congo is facing serious challenges, but there's a glimmer of hope following recent elections. The question, though, is will the new president be able to foster peace and win the hearts and minds of his detractors? South Africa says it will continue to support the DRC in its quest for peace. President Cyril Ramaphosa met with his Congolese counterpart, Tshisekedi, on the sidelines of the AU summit.
He's setting his government in place. He's going to be putting together a cabinet. So he is now involved in the task of forming a government. And clearly he's going to be appointing people who will do quite a lot of the work that needs to be done, including dealing with the challenges of people who are in exile, dealing with the challenges of the economy, dealing with the challenges of eradicating poverty in his country and infrastructure. So let us give President Tshisekedi a chance to succeed, and let us all back him and support him in the important work that he has to do, rather than become, people who are just armchair critics and throwing stones at the work that he still has to do.
Former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, also weighed in on the matter.
we are engaged in discussions with President Tshisekedi about the Congo at his request. So we will engage with him. We will engage the DRC in pursuit of these goals that we've tried to pursue over the years. Because the Congo is a very important African country. So you need a stable Congo, a peaceful Congo, a democratic Congo, and a Congo that contributes to peace in the region and development in the region and the continent as a whole. So I'm saying that we are engaged in discussions with President Tshisekedi with a view to ensuring that we can do whatever we can to assist with regard to the realization of those objectives. And so I'm very, very glad indeed that President Tshisekedi himself has said, look, let's talk. How do we achieve these objectives? It's an indication of his own seriousness about really basically turning over a new leaf for the Congo. And he has approached South Africa. And I'm sure South Africa will assist.
For President Thabo Mbeki talking about turning over a new leaf for the Democratic Republic of Congo. The complexity of fragile states was underscored by former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf when she characterized them by saying they have a scarcity of resources, the demand for urgent delivery of services is there, and managing expectations to prevent any chance of slipping back into conflict. Currently, 8 of 15 United Nations peacekeeping missions are deployed in Africa. Makhosini Nkosi is a political consultant, and he joins me here, an independent political consultant, to talk about these conflicts in Africa and the possibility of halving them. First of all, is it realistic? Vision 2020.
It's very difficult to be optimistic about it because you hear the resolutions that the heads of state and government make, but you don't see backup action that follows that. And you know, I think the biggest problem in Africa is that since its founding, the OAU, Organization of African Unity, had this mantra that they don't interfere in the affairs of member states. And I think the African Union inherited a lot of that. So you see the difficulties that are taking place on the African continent, but you don't see any leadership, decisive leadership, coming from the part of the AU.
Just on that point, the changeover of administrations or of leaders seems to create an impression that countries are starting over on a new leaf. I mean, if we look at a country such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, there seems to be tensions now, even post those peaceful elections.
Yes. You see, I think what has happened is that you don't see the leadership that you saw from Nigeria and South Africa during the time of Thabo Mbeki and the time of Olusegun Obasanjo, Abdoulaye Wade in Senegal, Abdulaziz Bouteflika of Algeria, though he seems to be deteriorating now. So I think there was leadership on the African continent. When they came with the African peer review mechanism, you could see that Africa was moving forward. Right, but with President Mbeki being removed from office in South Africa and Olusegun Obasanjo's term coming to an end in Nigeria, you had South Africa and Nigeria actually at each other's throats. You know, so I think that has affected a great deal the peace efforts and the progress of African countries.
So are we now looking at the facade of peace and forgetting about those fragile and vulnerable communities in those conflict situations?
I think there is talk. I think African leaders do meet, and I think they do talk. But I haven't seen any action. You know, if you take, for instance, the DRC that former President Thabo Mbeki was talking about and the current president was talking about, I mean, through all that happened, you know, the postponement of elections and the violence that would visit the people who would be trying to protest that you wouldn't sometimes even hear any criticism of that, let alone, you know, the involvement of countries like South Africa, like you saw it in the 90s, for instance, when there was conflict in the DRC during the time of Mobutu Sese Seko and Laurent Kabila, who wanted to overthrow him. South Africa sent a Navy ship somewhere near the waters of the Congo, where a summit could be held. That was South Africa getting involved, you know, not just issuing statements and talking from a distance.
And that involvement means a clear roadmap for disarmament of rebels, of warring or conflicting communities, and including the military. Has that happened fully and effectively in places like the DRC and both Sudans, for instance?
You know, there are also some complicating issues in my view. I was hoping that maybe former President Mbeki would allude to that when talking about the Sudan, for instance. The problem with Sudan, in my view, is that you have a president who has an active warrant of arrest out for him. And the only way in which he can protect himself from that warrant of arrest being executed is by staying in power. If you look at what happened in Cote d'Ivoire with Laurent Gbagbo, immediately he lost power, then he was shipped to the ICC. Even after he was acquitted, he was still there. So I think that becomes a deterrent sort of to African leaders who have been in power for a long time, who have themselves been involved in acts of a war or, you know, abuse of power, that they fear that I think, you know, al-Bashir has that huge headache that if he loses power, he's going straight to the to the Hague, and I don't think he would want to do. I think that does complicate on the continent when you're trying to resolve. I'm just looking
at the south of Sudan, and I'm looking at the eastern parts of the Congo, and we know there are communities there who have not been disarmed because they feel under threat.
Yes.
And I'm wondering then just how far the peace efforts go, and the machinery. We know we have the United Nations peacekeeping missions there, but the will by the incumbent governance to make sure that there is peace, that drills down to.
You know, in truth, not everybody wants peace. Other people thrive. There are leaders who thrive in conditions of war, in conditions of conflict and chaos. And if you bring about order, then it simply means that they are unable to stay on in power, and therefore they would want chaos to continue. So I think that does complicate matters, and I think the posture of the African Union, that of not wanting to criticize sitting heads of state and government, I think it does complicate also.
Okay, so we'll come back to the framing of the framework for good governance and also respecting of human rights when we come back here on African Perspective. Don't go away.